Hi everyone. We finished part 1 of the textbook last week. We will start part 2 today. The first chapter of part 2, chapter 5, is about analyzing arguments. Remember, I said that logic is the science of evaluating arguments. So we will eventually get to the task of evaluating arguments. But before we can evaluate and learn the techniques to sort out good arguments from bad ones, we need to be able to recognize arguments first. There are many writings that we confront, and some writings contain arguments and other writings don't. So when we read newspaper or magazine or book, we need to be able to recognize an argument first. Only then we can ask whether the argument is good or bad. So recognizing arguments and analyzing argument is what we do in this chapter. What is an argument? An argument is a set of sentences that must have these two parts, premise part and the conclusion part. Premises are what you take to support the conclusion. We say premises are the evidences or the reasons or the grounds for the conclusion. The conclusion is your belief or your claim. Okay? So an argument must have these two parts, that you state your belief and you make an assertion and say, this is what I believe, and then you add your reasons why you believe what you believe. Then that whole package, the claim and the premises, that whole package is called an argument. So an argument must have those two parts in it. So a single sentence does not make an argument. For example, someone says, God exists, or whatever, or let's say abortion is morally wrong. Stating your opinion does not amount to an argument. So as far as stating one's opinion goes, there is nothing that logicians are interested in. The logic starts when you add your claim or belief, the reasons why that is the case. When you present an argument, that's where logic starts. Okay? So a single sentence does not make an argument. Only a set of sentences with the two parts that I mentioned ago. Now, a set of sentences, not all set of sentences are arguments though. Some sets of sentences are arguments, but other sets of sentences are not. For example, a newspaper article report is not an argument, although it may contain a number of sentences. So mere description of facts, newspaper reports, contracts are not arguments. The author just is not interested in stating one's opinion and try to back it up. That's not what the person is interested in. When the person merely describes a fact or report, a certain event. Right? The newspaper reporter just take it for granted that the listener or viewer will believe what he or she says and just describe what he or she observes. Okay? That's not an argument. Now there is this example explanation, and it is a bit tricky to distinguish an explanation from an argument, because an explanation looks very much like an argument. So we need to kind of talk a little bit more about the difference between an explanation and argument. I will explain a little bit more, okay? Both arguments and explanations may contain the word because, okay? Because is called, because is considered as a premise indicator. You state opinion and someone asks why that is the case, and you say because this and that. So because indicates that what follows after because are the reasons that you take to support the conclusion. So that's why it's called premise indicator. But in an explanation, we see because too. So that's why it's confusing. Okay? They have a similar structure. Both of them have this kind of structure. C because P1, P2, ... Pn. Now, where lies the difference then? In an explanation, the truth of C is taken for granted, and one just tries to explain why C happened. In contrast, in an argument, the truth of C is very much what is at issue, and one tries to provide reasons why C is true. If you see an example, you will understand the difference between them, I think, more clearly. Let's look at this example. I think it's many years ago, the space shuttle was exploded in the air, I think less than a minute after launching. Because there was, I think there was a mechanical failure with its ignition system. Is this an argument or explanation? Now this is an explanation. Why? Presumably the author takes this for granted. The space shuttle was exploded. That happened. Okay? And we just want to know why that happened. And what follows after because, it seems, is intended as providing an answer to that question. Okay? This happened. Yeah, that's true. But why did that happen? Well, because of mechanical failure, and so on. So this is an explanation. Okay? Now suppose if you want to have an argument with this sentence as its conclusion, what might be appropriate premises? Now if you are trying to argue for this conclusion, the space shuttle was exploded in the air after launching. That is, the context is people still have not heard about it and do not believe what you are saying. And they are doubting whether the space shuttle actually exploded or not. Okay, that's the circumstance. And here you are trying to present reasons why this is actually true. So I may say something like, the space shuttle was exploded in the air after launching because I saw it, I was there, or I saw it in the newspaper. And that's the kind of thing you would say if you were trying to provide an argument. Okay? So that's the difference. Okay? But other than explanation. Okay, this is a bit tricky, but other than that, I think it's fairly clear whether a piece of writing contains an argument or just a non-argument. Okay? We need to become more sensitive to whether a piece of writing contains an argument. Okay? So that means we need to be able to distinguish whether a piece of writing contains an argument or just a non-argument. Diagramming an argument. This method helps us to see the flow of arguments, which supports which. Now, suppose if an argument if a piece of writing contains an argument, then the next step is we have to ask, what is the conclusion of the argument and what are the premises? So to recognize to identify the conclusion and the premises of an argument is our next step. Right? Now, the relationship between the premises and conclusion can come in two different ways. That is, the way premises back up the conclusion can be of these two different types. The first type is called joint support. For example, this is an argument. Okay? Here is an argument. The first premise is John is taller than Bill. The second premise, Bill is taller than Sam. Therefore, the conclusion is John is taller than Sam. I mean, it's a short argument, simple argument, but it's enough to illustrate the idea of joint support. Notice that the first premise or second premise alone has no tendency to support conclusion. Suppose that you just ignore, okay, the second premise. Suppose you just have John is taller than Bill. Does that mean that John is taller than Sam? Not at all. Right? The first premise alone has nothing to suggest that John is taller than Sam. We don't know Sam yet. But notice that when you add these two premises together, now they support this quite well. Okay? So we can see the manner in which these two premises work together, cooperate to support the conclusion. So when this happens, we say the premises give joint support of the conclusion. And we indicate this fact by drawing in this way. The premise 1 and premise 2, they work together to support conclusion. Okay? We indicate the joint support in a diagram in this way. Okay? We can compare joint support with independent support. Here, okay, each premise without the other gives at least some support for the conclusion. First, the people choose the legislature. Second premise, the people serve as jurors in courts. Therefore, the people control the actions of the government. In this argument, you can recognize that just the first premise alone, the people chooses the legislature, that at least gives some support for the conclusion. Likewise, for the second premise, the people serve as jurors in courts. That fact in itself gives at least some support for the conclusion. So in this case, we say 1 and 2 independently supports the conclusion and indicates this fact by drawing in this way. 1, 2, each of them supports the conclusion. Okay? So remember these two different types of how premises support the conclusion. Okay, complex arguments. If we, I don't know, depending on whether it's joint or independent support, C, I don't know. Let's suppose that the P1, P2, P3 independently supports C. Let's just assume that. Okay. In many cases, you argue C because P1 and P2 and P3. Now, when you present an argument like that, it's very likely that people would ask, okay, given that P1, P2, P3 are true, yeah, C is true, but why should I accept P1? That is, they ask for the grounds for believing P1 itself. So in this case, you have to provide an argument for P1 itself. So maybe you say P1 because of R1 and R2. I don't know, maybe let's assume that R1 and R2 jointly supports P1. Okay? R1 again is supported by S1, S2, S3. Okay? So you can see that an argument may contain small argument within it. Okay? This is called complex arguments. An argument may have different multiple steps. And the diagramming method can give us an overview of the structure of an argument visually. Okay? We can see right away which part supports which in an argument. And the purpose of diagramming method is to help us to see the structure of an argument. Okay. And in diagramming an argument, as I said, okay, the difference between joint support or independent support, that's the most crucial difference that you must remember. Logical strengths. Okay. Now, suppose you recognize, okay, this piece of writing contains an argument. Okay, this is conclusion. These are the premises. And these premises supports that part. And you suppose you have a diagrammed argument. Now, the next step is that argument good or bad? Okay? And we say that we use the word logical strengths. This means how much support does a premise give for a conclusion? Okay? Does a particular premise actually give us good reason to believe the conclusion true? Okay? And here we traditionally there is the philosophers have distinguished deductive arguments and inductive arguments. Deductive arguments and inductive arguments are distinguished by the kind of criterion we bring in to evaluate an argument. Okay? Let's see deductive argument first. You make a deductive argument when you make an argument in the following fashion. You say, given that these premises are true, I claim that the conclusion must be true. Okay? When you argue in this definitive fashion, you are presenting a deductive argument. Okay? So a deductive argument is an argument where your intention is to argue in the following fashion. That if the premises are true, that the conclusion must be true. When your intention is that, then you are presenting a deductive argument. A deductive argument has very high standard. Okay? It comes with a very high standard. That a deductive argument is good when, if the premises are true, then the conclusion is actually true. Okay? So we say a valid argument. Deductive argument divides into valid and invalid. Okay? A deductive argument divides into valid arguments and invalid arguments. A valid argument, the definition is this. If all the premises are true, then the conclusion is also true. Another definition of valid argument is that it is impossible that all the premises are true and the conclusion is false. It is impossible. On the other hand, invalid arguments are such that an invalid argument is an argument that is not valid. Okay? I will give some examples of a valid argument. Suppose someone argues in the following way. X is a natural number. Like 0, 1, 2, 3. And second premise is suppose that X is in between 2 and 5. Suppose someone argues that X is a natural number and X is bigger than 2 and smaller than 5. Therefore, X is identical to 3. Is this a valid argument? Now remember the definition of validity. If an argument is valid, the following conditions holds. That is, if all the premises are true, the conclusion must be true. So in order to tell whether this is a valid argument or not, you ask the question. If the premise, there are two premises, premise 1, premise 2. If these two are true, is the conclusion also true? And you can see that, the conclusion need not be true. Because given that X is a natural number and X is between 2 and 5, X might be 4. So the conclusion, X is identical to 3, does not follow from these two premises. So what that means is this argument is not valid. Now suppose I add another premise to this argument. Suppose I say X is an odd number. Okay? Suppose if I add this premise as additional premise, P3, then is this valid argument? Given that P1, P2, P3 are true, is the conclusion also true? And the answer is yes. Okay? Given that X is a natural number and X is in between 2 and 5, and furthermore, X is an odd number, X must be 3. Okay? So the conclusion follows from 3 premises. And this is a valid argument. So you can see that the mark of validity, that in a valid argument, these premises, a set of sentences, seem to force the conclusion. Okay? These 3 sentences makes the conclusion inevitable. Okay? Given that the premises are all true, the conclusion has to be true. That's the mark of validity. Let us look at another example. And this example is especially useful because it illustrates the idea that validity of an argument is not directly related to the actual truth value of premises or the conclusion. Okay, let me explain. Let us look at this example. Okay, here is an example of an argument. There are two premises, and the conclusion is or A or C. An actual example of an argument that has this form is this. The argument says all actors live in LA. The second premise, all people who live in LA are rich. Therefore, the argument says the actors are rich. Notice that the first premise and neither the second premise is actually true. But does that make this argument invalid? Not necessarily. Because in order to see if this argument is valid, you have to ask the following question. If the premises are true, is the conclusion necessarily true? That's the question you have to ask. So if all actors live in LA and all people who live in LA are rich, does it follow that all actors are rich? And the answer is yes. That means this argument is valid. Validity is a matter of connection. Okay? A set of sentences makes the conclusion inevitably true. Okay? So this is valid even though none of its premises and the conclusion are actually true. So this can be confusing. So keep in mind that validity of an argument is not directly related to the actual truth value of premises or the conclusion. Let's move on to the definition of soundness. A sound argument is a valid argument with all true premises. Now, the previous example of valid argument illustrates that some valid arguments may have false premises. That's possible. So we can have the definition of soundness, which is stronger than the condition of validity. Okay? A sound argument is a valid argument plus additional condition. That is, the premises have to be actually true. Only in that case, an argument is sound. So a sound argument is a valid argument and all true premises. These two conditions must be satisfied for an argument to be sound. Now you have to ask yourself, a sound argument must have a true conclusion. Is this true or false? A sound argument must have a true conclusion. Because a valid argument, by definition, is an argument in which if all the premises are true, then the conclusion must be true, and premises are all true, so the conclusion must be true. So this is true. Okay? A sound argument must have a true conclusion. Sound argument is roughly what corresponds to a good argument in ordinary language. When we say an argument is good, what we mean roughly corresponds to the concept of soundness. A sound argument is such that all premises are true. So that means the starting point is good. We start with the true premises. And a sound argument is also valid. That means the conclusion follows from the premises. So when those two conditions are satisfied, there is true premises and you argue validly from the premises to the conclusion, then you have a sound argument, and that roughly corresponds to a good argument in ordinary usage. Okay. There are two ways you can criticize an argument. The definition of a sound argument suggests two ways in which an argument can go wrong. An argument can go wrong by being invalid or having a false premise. Okay? So either this condition or that condition is not satisfied, it is not a sound argument. Okay? So when you criticize an argument, you can point out that, well, one of the premises that you present is not true. That's one way to criticize an argument. Another way to criticize an argument is, even if all your premises are true, the conclusion does not necessarily follow. That's another way to criticize an argument. Okay, that wrap up our discussion of deductive argument, and let's move on to inductive argument. Inductive argument is divided into two kinds: strong and weak argument. Strong argument is if premises are true, then the conclusion is very likely to be true. The conclusion is probably true. Okay? That is a strong inductive argument. Weak inductive argument is an argument that is not strong. Okay? Inductive argument is a matter of degree. That is, you can see that some inductive argument is stronger than other inductive arguments. Okay? You cannot, if you ask me, how much percentage is required for an argument to be strong? Okay? It should be very high number, like 95%. But it could be like 92%. There is no strict line that divides strong and weak. Inductive argument is a matter of degree, while the deductive argument is white and black and white. Okay? Either a deductive argument is either valid or invalid. There are only two kinds. But inductive argument comes in degrees. Okay? Some inductive argument is stronger than others. Okay, in this class, we will skip inductive argument, and we will focus on the evaluation of deductive arguments in this class. Let me summarize what has gone so far. This diagram may be useful for you to remember what has gone so far. Remember, we talked about recognizing arguments. That is, a set of sentences are divided into arguments and non-arguments. Okay? Some set of sentences are arguments. Arguments, again, divide into deductive and inductive argument. Deductive arguments, again, divides into valid and invalid. Inductive argument is divided into strong and weak. And valid arguments, some valid arguments are sound and others are unsound. Okay? So this diagram kind of sums up what has gone so far. And I hope this helps you to remember the overall view of things here. There is another item that I like to explain in this chapter. Let's move on to the final thing here. In the textbook, you will see the concept of implicit premise. What is an implicit premise? Sometimes people don't state all the premises that they take to support the conclusion. Why? They think that everybody accepts it, or that it's too obvious, that there is no need to state explicitly. But when we are trying to evaluate an argument, it is very important to specify the implicit premises. Because sometimes when the implicit premises are made explicit, we can sometimes recognize that the implicit premises are controversial. Okay? So, for some arguments, it is important to make implicit premises explicit. Okay? Okay. Implicit premises are premises that must be present in order to make the argument plausible. Okay? In the textbook, there is a very good example of implicit premise. For example, consider this argument: bungee jumping is dangerous, therefore there must be a law against it. Now, is there an implicit premise here? It seems there is. Okay? From the fact that bungee jumping is dangerous, it doesn't necessarily follow that there must be a law against it, unless you make the assumption that the government should ban things that are dangerous. Unless you add this assumption, premise, the conclusion doesn't necessarily follow. So there is an implicit premise that must be present in order to make the argument plausible. Okay? There are some other examples in the textbook that illustrates the idea of implicit premise. Okay, that's the last item in this chapter. See you next time.